Hi, I'm Steve Caseley from MicroNuggets, and this MicroNugget is focused on Scrum rituals. And Scrum rituals are the prescribed processes that must be followed to apply Scrum management principles on your project. There are only 5 Scrum rituals that need to be applied and are fairly easy to apply, so there's no reason to not follow the processes defined by Scrum. The first is the Daily Scrum, the 15-minute review with every team member of how well they're doing. The release plan, a planning process where the product owner defines the direction. The sprint plan, a planning process that takes place once per sprint. So once every 2 to 4 weeks, we do a sprint plan to identify the exact stories that are going to be completed in this sprint. We do the work for the sprint, and then at the end of each sprint, we do a sprint review. So again, it's 1 per sprint, where we present the results to the product owner, and we get the product owner's acceptance that the sprint has accomplished what it was set out to do. And finally, again, once per sprint, a sprint retrospective where we focus on process improvements. The most commonly known of the Scrum rituals is the Daily Scrum, or the Daily Stand-Up, or the 15-minute. The key point to the Daily Scrum I want to drive home is that the Daily Scrum is mandatory. Team members are not optional. Team members are expected, if they are at work for this business day, to attend the Daily Scrum. The intention is they're very brief, 15 minutes or less. We never want them to go longer than 15 minutes, and that's the key reason we make the Daily Scrum the stand-up. If people are standing up, they're not as comfortable, they're not as prone for discussion, they are there to get the job done. And what is the job? 3 questions. What did I accomplish today? Or what did I accomplish since the last Scrum? What do I plan to do between now and the next Scrum? And what are the blockers? And that's it. Go around the room, talk to every team member. What did I do since the last Scrum? What do I plan to do for the next? And are there any blockers? And that's it. We don't want to problem solve. We don't want to discuss. We don't want to. If there's any other discussions that come out of this review, you take it offline. The focus for the Scrum is to do the status and nothing but the status. But long before we get to the Daily Scrum, in Scrum we need to do release planning. Release planning is the responsibility of the product owner and may include all stakeholders. The project team, the Scrum Master, business subject matter experts, and maybe even the product owner's boss. And in the release plan, we define the medium-term plans. Typically in release planning, we're looking at least 1 release out and potentially as many as 3 releases out. What is a release? A release is an implementation. Taking all of the results of all of the development that has happened in this release and putting it into production. Typically, a release is going to be several sprints worth of work, where a sprint is typically 2 to 4 weeks of effort, and typically in 2 to 4 weeks we can't have enough production-ready code to warrant the overhead of implementation, so we will combine several sprints into a release. And in release planning, we define what the medium-term plans are so that the team has this forward vision of what they're going to do, not just in the next sprint or the next release, but several releases out. With the vision set in release planning, the next planning process is sprint planning. We do a sprint plan for every sprint. So every 2 to 4 weeks, we go through a sprint plan. There's two parts to the sprint plan. Part one is really the responsibility of the product owner, but it's done with the team and with the Scrum Master. Part one of a sprint plan should never take more than 2 hours. Hopefully we can fine-tune our process and get it done in less than 2 hours, but we should set an absolute cap of 2 hours on the part one. And what we do in part one is we go through the entire product backlog and we select the next highest priority, stories. So literally, sprint planning should be as simple as going to the product backlog, picking the highest priority stories that can be completed within the capacity of a sprint. So pick the stories that can be done in 2 weeks, assuming we're doing a 2-week sprint, or pick the appropriate number of stories that could be done in 4 weeks, assuming we're doing a 4-week sprint, and part one is complete. Stories identified leads us into part two of the sprint plan, can take place immediately afterwards. Again, should take no more than 2 hours. The focus of part two is the team. The product owner is optional, more than welcome to stay. But in part two, the team reviews and validates the stories. Do they know enough to do the work, to write the code? i.e., are the stories truly sprint ready, in which that they're well defined and therefore the team says fine. And once they validate the stories, the team then does the detailed work plan. Who's going to do the work and how's this going to be broken down? Do I need to do a couple of hours of analysis? Do I need to do a couple of hours of design? How much time is going to take for development? How much time is going to take for testing? And with that, stories are identified and the detailed work plans are in place. The team does the work through the sprint. Daily scrums take place. And at the end of the sprint, we do a sprint review. We do a sprint review at the end of every sprint. Much like the planning process, ideal length is 2 hours, but again, should never take more than 4 hours to do a sprint review. Basically, the sprint review is a show and tell. We present the results to the business owner, to the product owner, and we validate that the definition of done on each story has been satisfied, and in fact the stories are complete, and the expectation of the product owner for the sprint has been satisfied. And finally, the sprint retrospective, also done at the end of each sprint, and I actually say the sprint retrospective is done immediately after the sprint. Same basic time frame, let's try to get it done in 2, but never more than 4. And the focus of the sprint retrospective is process improvement. It's done with the product owner, with the team, and with the Scrum Master. And the focus of the sprint retrospective is to identify the to-dos, the action item, to ensure that we learn from the mistakes, that we repeat our successes, and we get progressively better within our Scrum itself. Probably shouldn't say this. It's a key step and should never be skipped, but there is a focus in some organizations of saying sprint retrospectives I'm not going to do after every sprint, I'm going to do it after every 2 or every 3. In my humble opinion, not a good practice. We should do a sprint retrospective at the end of every sprint, and I'm going to cross that out, although I do recognize there are organizations that do not complete a retrospective at the end of every sprint. This concludes our overview of Scrum rituals. I hope this has been informative for you, and thank you very much for viewing.